The first box hit the pavement and split open. A winter coat spilled out, one sleeve stretched across the concrete like an arm reaching for something. A stack of folded blouses followed, sliding off the curb into the gutter. Then a framed photograph, the glass cracking against the asphalt with a sound like a single sharp word. And inside that cracked frame, two people stood at an altar on June 14th, 1974, smiling at a future they did not yet know the shape of. Lavinia Langford, 80 years old, stood on the front steps of the apartment building and watched her life get stacked on a public sidewalk in Columbus, Ohio, like items marked for disposal. Her son Willard was wearing a golf jacket, green and expensive. The kind of jacket a man wears when he wants to look casual, but also wants you to know he can afford not to be. He carried boxes from the minivan without looking at her. Not once. Not a glance over his shoulder, not a pause to ask if she was cold, nothing. He worked efficiently, the way a man works, when he has already made a decision, and the only thing left is the physical execution of it. The last box went down. Willard straightened up. He looked at his phone. He said 4 words. "You'll be fine, Mom." He got in the minivan and drove away. Lavinia stood on those steps and watched the taillights until they turned the corner and disappeared. The November wind moved through the street and rearranged the sleeve of her winter coat on the pavement, but she did not go down to pick it up. She stood very still. She had spent a lifetime in motion, cooking and driving and sitting in emergency rooms at 2 in the morning, in sewing costumes and packing lunches, and now she stood completely still and let the wind do what it wanted. There was one thing on that sidewalk that did not belong with the boxes of clothes and kitchen items. A metal toolbox, red, the paint worn thin at the corners, the latch marked with years of use. It was Mortimer's, the set of tools he had used to fix every hinge, every leaking faucet, every cracked outlet cover in their house on Maple Creek Drive for 38 years. Willard had not taken it. There was nothing in it worth taking. Lavinia walked down the steps. She picked up the red toolbox. She carried it inside. She did not know why. She only knew that no one else was going to. Stay with me on this one, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about what it means to be left behind. For 52 years, Lavinia Langford had done one thing with sustained and total commitment. She had taken care of people, not in a dramatic way, not in the way that gets noticed or celebrated or even remembered with any accuracy, in the invisible way. The way that keeps a family running when nobody is paying attention to the machinery. She raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom house. She cooked every meal. She drove every carpool and attended every school play and sat in the emergency room at 2 in the morning when Willard's fever wouldn't break at age 7, and again at 3 in the morning when Garrison put his hand through a glass door at age 14, and neither time did she call Mortimer at the hotel where he was staying for a regional conference, because she knew he needed his sleep for the morning session. When she unpacked into the apartment, she found 3 things at the bottom of the last box that told the whole story of those 52 years more clearly than any speech could have. The first was a small spiral notebook, dark blue cover, the kind sold at any drugstore for $2. Lavinia had used it to track the family's schedule for 20 years. Vaccination dates for all 3 children, Willard's exam schedule junior year, Gwendolyn's drama performance, the one where she played a tree and cried for a week beforehand because she wanted a speaking role, Garrison's baseball games, the fields, the times, the snacks Lavinia was responsible for bringing. 20 years of a family's life recorded in her handwriting. She sat on the edge of the bed and flipped through it from the first page to the last. There was not a single entry for herself, not one appointment, not one obligation, not one line that said this was something Lavinia needed or wanted or had agreed to do for her own reasons. She was not a person in that notebook. She was the person who kept the notebook. The second thing was a shoebox. Inside it, every Mother's Day card she had received in 30 years. She opened one at random. "Thanks for everything, Mom. Love, Will." She opened another. "You're the best. Love, Garrison." She went through 6 of them. None was longer than 2 sentences. None of them asked her a single question. 30 years of cards that thanked her for everything, without any of the senders knowing what everything actually was. The third thing was a folder of check stubs. The last check she had written to Garrison was for $3,200 dated August of the previous year. The note in the memo line in her own handwriting said rent plus food. The one before that was $1,800. The one before that was $2,500. She added the numbers on the back of an envelope, $31,000 over 12 years. Garrison had never been asked to pay any of it back, and Lavinia had never once said no, and Garrison had never once asked why she never said no. She put the folder back in the box. She put the box in the closet. She made herself a bowl of cereal because she could not see the point of cooking a real meal for one person, and she ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the parking lot on the other side of the glass. She counted 11 cars. Mortimer Langford had worked in commercial insurance for 30 years with a company based in Columbus. Good income, consistent. He left the house at 7:15 every morning and came home at 6 in the evening, sometimes 6:30, occasionally 8, if there was a client dinner. Twice a year in March and in September, he attended a regional conference. 4 or 5 days, always a Midwestern city, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Cincinnati. He always brought something back. A jar of local preserves, a hardcover book he had seen in a hotel gift shop, a postcard. Lavinia kept all the postcards in a shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet, the same way she kept everything organized and labeled and preserved long after the original occasion had passed. Mortimer paid for everything related to their car in cash. Gas, car washes, small repairs. "It's easier," he said once when Lavinia asked about it. She had nodded and not asked again. She was very good at not asking again. She found out later, much later, that cash transactions don't appear on joint account statements. She found out that a man who plans carefully enough can maintain two entirely separate financial identities for 35 years without his wife ever seeing a single number that doesn't add up. She found out that easier was a word Mortimer used when he meant something else. But that was later. On a Tuesday in April, Mortimer Langford died in his recliner watching a baseball game. The Cardinals were playing the Cubs. The score was 3-1 in the 7th inning. Lavinia came in from the garden, and the coffee on the side table beside him was still warm, and she knew before she touched his hand. She called 911. She sat down next to him and held his hand while she waited. His hand was still warm, too. The paramedics came, then the funeral director, then Willard and Gwendolyn, and Garrison in that order, Gwendolyn with flowers she had bought at the airport. Garrison 40 minutes late, with his tie crooked and a look on his face like a man who had been running and didn't know what toward. People said the right things at the funeral. Mortimer was a good man. Mortimer was a provider. Mortimer loved his family. Lavinia sat in the front row in a black dress she had bought 10 years ago for her friend Harriet's husband's service, and thought about how little she actually knew about the 30 years Mortimer had spent inside that insurance company. She knew the name of his boss in 1987. She knew the company had merged with a larger firm in 2002. She knew he drove a gray Buick. That was approximately the extent of it. She had spent 46 years married to a man whose professional life was as opaque to her as a closed door, and it had never occurred to her to knock. That night, after everyone had gone home and the casseroles were stacked in the refrigerator and the house was quiet, Lavinia sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where she had written grocery lists and signed permission slips and helped with algebra problems, and listened to 3 separate teenagers explain why their curfew was unreasonable. She sat there for a long time and tried to think of Mortimer's favorite meal. She knew he didn't like carrots when they were cooked too soft. She knew he took his coffee black. She knew he preferred the window seat on airplanes and that he could not fall asleep in a moving car. But his favorite meal, the thing he would have chosen if she had asked him on any given evening for the past 46 years, that she did not know. Because he had never told her, and she had never asked, and they had lived together in the same house with great efficiency and almost no real curiosity about each other, and now he was gone, and the question had no answer, and the table felt enormous. She was still sitting there when her neighbor, Philippa Caldwell, knocked on the back door at 9 in the evening with a foil-covered dish and a look of fierce, particular concern that Lavinia had known for 30 years. Philippa was 73, 5 feet tall, and one of the few people Lavinia had ever known who said exactly what she was thinking without apologizing for it afterward. "You need to eat something that isn't cereal," Philippa said, setting the dish on the counter. "I had cereal." "You have cereal every time you don't know what else to do. I've watched you do it for 30 years. Lavinia almost smiled. "I don't know what else to do." "I know." Philippa pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "What are Willard and Gwendolyn saying about the house?" "Willard says it's too much for me to manage alone. He wants to set up a trust for the proceeds." "What kind of trust?" "He manages it for my care." Philippa looked at her for a long moment. "And you're going to let him do that?" Lavinia was quiet. "Lavinia, you ran this house for 38 years. You managed every dollar that came through it. You know what a trust is. Mortimer always handled the finances." Philippa's expression shifted in a way Lavinia felt rather than saw. "And now Mortimer is gone," she said carefully, "and Willard wants to step directly into that role." Lavinia looked down at the table. "He's my son." "Yes," Philippa said, "he is." She left an hour later. Lavinia sat with the casserole chicken and rice and ate half of it, standing at the counter looking out at the parking lot. She counted the cars again. 14 this time. 3 weeks later, Willard sat across from her at that same kitchen table with a folder and a set of numbers in the calm, measured voice of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say. The property taxes had increased 18% the previous year. The roof needed replacing, estimated cost $28,000. The furnace had triggered an error code twice during the past winter. "It's just too much to manage alone, Mom. We want to make sure you're protected." "Where does the money go when the house sells?" "Into the trust. I manage it. It simplifies things on the tax side." "Do I have documentation for this trust?" A pause, short but real. "It's a little complex on the legal side. You don't need to worry about that part." Lavinia looked at her son's face. She was looking for something specific, though she could not have named it precisely in that moment. What she found was not worry, and it was not love, and it was not even impatience. It was calculation. The steady, frictionless expression of a person who has already decided how this conversation ends and is simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. She had seen that expression before, on Mortimer when he explained something she was not supposed to ask follow-up questions about. She picked up the pen, she signed. Not because she believed him. She signed because she had nothing concrete to hold against his folder and his numbers and his calm voice. She had spent a lifetime trusting the people who handled things, and she did not yet have the tools to stop. 6 weeks after that conversation, the house sold. The money did not come to her. Willard said it had gone into the trust. Gwendolyn said she was busy when Lavinia called to ask about it. Garrison didn't answer. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on the east side of Columbus with no elevator. 1 bedroom, 1 window facing the parking lot walls, the color of old chalk. Lavinia moved in with 3 boxes of clothes, her good set of dishes, the quilt her mother had made 50 years ago, and the red toolbox. The building manager was a man named Roger Tillis, 55, who met Lavinia in the hallway during her 2nd week with a noise complaint someone from the adjacent unit had filed. He said there had been sounds of furniture being moved after midnight. "I was organizing my things," Lavinia said. "You should have your kids help with the heavy lifting," Roger said. "My children aren't here," Lavinia said. Roger nodded and walked away without asking why. Gwendolyn called once to suggest Lavinia download a grocery delivery application on her phone. Lavinia did not own a smartphone. She walked 6 blocks to the supermarket with 2 canvas bags, bought what she needed, and walked 6 blocks back. Her hip ached for 3 days afterward. No one called to ask about it. Every evening, Lavinia opened the red toolbox and looked inside. She did not take anything out. Screwdrivers, an adjustable wrench, a roll of yellow masking tape, a small box of nails. She would look at these things for 2 or 3 minutes, then close the lid and turn off the light. She did this 11 nights in a row. On the 12th evening, she was sorting through a box of Mortimer's papers that had been overlooked in the move. Receipts, old tax returns, an owner's manual for a lawnmower they had donated to a church sale in 2003. She found the shoebox of postcards first. She had forgotten she had packed it. She sat on the floor of the bedroom and spread the postcards around her in a rough arc. Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Cincinnati. 11 years of regional conferences, 11 cities, all of them within a 6-hour drive of Columbus. She turned each one over and read the messages Mortimer had written on the back. Weather cold meetings, long home Thursday, M. Reminded today why I don't like Cleveland, back Friday, M. There was not a single postcard from a city west of Chicago. Not one. In 30 years of conferences and business travel, Mortimer Langford had never once sent a postcard from the West Coast. The envelope was tucked between two folders of tax returns, the 2018 filing and the 2019 filing pressed flat so that it lay nearly invisible against the cardboard bottom of the box. Clearwater Storage, LLC, Oceanside, California, Unit Number 1174. Account holder, Mortimer R. Langford. Account active since November 1989. Payment method, annual automatic renewal. Next payment due 30 days. Lavinia sat with that invoice for a long time. She called Willard. His voice was easy, unbothered. Dad probably opened that years ago and forgot to cancel it. Just let it lapse, Mom. Don't worry about it. She thanked him and hung up the phone. Then she sat very still in the center of the bedroom floor, surrounded by postcards from cities in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, holding a storage invoice for a facility in a state Mortimer Langford had, as far as she had ever known, never once visited. Nobody pays 35 years of automatic renewal fees on something they forgot. Nobody organizes a storage unit, maintains it for 3.5 decades, pays the bill without fail every single year, and then simply forgets it exists. A man who forgets things doesn't set up automatic renewals. A man who is hiding something does. Lavinia set the invoice on the nightstand. She opened the closet and reached up to the top shelf, moving aside a folded blanket until her hand found the edge of her passport. She pulled it down and opened it to the photo page. The woman looking back at her from that picture had been 68 years old when it was taken. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Lavinia recognized her. She set the passport on the nightstand next to the invoice. She went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the small table by the window and watched the parking lot below while the tea cooled, and she thought about what a person does when they discover that the life they believed they were living may have had a shadow life running alongside it, unseen for longer than some people are alive. She thought about Mortimer in his recliner. She thought about the coffee still warm on the side table beside him. She thought about 46 years of trust placed in a man who set up automatic renewal payments for a storage unit in California and told his wife nothing about it for 35 years. She did not cry. There was something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger. Something older and more solid than either of those. The feeling of a person who has just understood something they should have understood much sooner and is now deciding what to do about it. She booked a flight on her telephone, the landline, by calling the airline directly and speaking to a representative named Julie who was patient with her and walked her through the process 3 times until the confirmation number was written down clearly on a notepad in Lavinia's handwriting. She did not tell Willard. She did not tell Gwendolyn. She did not tell Garrison. She packed a small bag, a change of clothes, her good walking shoes, the invoice, the death certificate, the marriage certificate, her passport, and $400 in cash from the envelope she kept in the back of the desk drawer, the emergency money she had maintained for 30 years without Mortimer ever knowing it existed. She set the red toolbox on the floor beside the door where she would see it when she left in the morning. She was 80 years old. She had never boarded an airplane without someone beside her. She had never driven on a California highway. She had never walked into a storage facility in a city she had never visited to open a unit that should not exist in the name of a man who was supposed to have been transparent with her for nearly 5 decades. She turned off the light. She slept. She had never told anyone on an airplane the truth before. The woman in the seat beside her was somewhere around 45. Laptop opened, the particular focused expression of someone who works during flights as a matter of professional identity. She glanced at Lavinia the way people glance at elderly women in window seats briefly and without real interest, and asked if Lavinia was visiting family in California. She had been asked the same question on the flight out. This time, she had a different answer. "No," she said, "I'm going to take back something that belongs to me." The woman looked up from her screen. Lavinia had already turned to the window. Below them, the landscape had gone from green and flat to brown and folded the earth, creasing itself into shapes that looked deliberate from 30,000 feet, like something planned by a patient and very old intelligence. She had gotten through the security checkpoint at John Glenn Airport at 5:40 in the morning without assistance and without incident. A TSA agent had asked her to remove her shoes. She had sat down on the bench, provided remove them one at a time, placed them in the gray bin, and walked through the scanner in her stocking feet while the man behind her exhaled loudly through his nose. She had heard him. She had not looked back. She collected her shoes on the other side, put them on, and walked to her gate. Not courage, just continuation. She had rented a car at the airport using a process that took longer than it should have because the agent, a young woman named Becca with copper-colored hair and the specific cheerfulness of someone 3 hours into an 8-hour shift, kept offering upgrades Lavinia did not want and insurance packages Lavinia did not need. Lavinia said no to each one clearly and without apology. She bought a small GPS unit at the rental counter for $19, entered the address for Clearwater Storage in Oceanside, and drove out of the parking structure into California sunlight. Her hands on the wheel were steady. She drove at a consistent pace and followed the GPS directions without second-guessing them, even when the route took her through an interchange that required 3-lane changes in quick succession. She had driven in Columbus for 50 years. A California freeway was the same physics applied to different geography. Clearwater Storage was in a commercial strip off Interstate 5. A tan building with roll-up metal doors surrounded by a chain-link fence and a sign advertising climate-controlled units. The kind of facility that exists in every mid-sized American city, utterly unremarkable, designed to hold the overflow of people's lives without drawing any attention to itself. Lavinia parked, gathered her documents into a neat stack in her bag, and went inside. The office smelled of industrial cleaner and old carpet. A man was seated behind the counter, heavy-set 40 years old, wearing a gray polo shirt with the company logo. His name tag said Horatio. He looked up when she entered with the flat attention of someone who has processed thousands of transactions and expects this one to be indistinguishable from the rest. "I need to access Unit 1174, Lavinia said. "The account holder was my husband. He passed away 6 weeks ago." Horatio asked for her ID and the death certificate. She produced both from the folder in her bag, along with the marriage certificate and her passport, all of it paper-clipped together in the order she anticipated being asked for it. He looked at the documents, typed something into his computer, and then his expression shifted in a small, specific way. "There's a notation on this account," he said. "The primary account holder requested restricted access. Third-party entry requires a secondary confirmation code." "I'm not a third party. I'm his legal surviving spouse." "I understand that. But our policy in cases where the account holder has flagged restricted access is to require additional verification before we can grant entry." Lavinia did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward or cross her arms or do any of the things a person does when they are preparing to escalate a confrontation. She simply said, "Can you show me that policy in writing?" Horatio paused. "I would also like to know," Lavinia continued, "whether a restricted access notation entered by a deceased account holder supersedes the legal rights of a surviving spouse under California probate code, because my understanding is that it does not. But I'm not a lawyer, and I may be wrong about the specifics." She was not wrong about the specifics. She had spent 2 evenings on the public library's internet terminals before her flight looking up exactly this question. Horatio said he needed to call his regional manager. "Of course," Lavinia said. "I'll wait." She sat down on a plastic chair against the wall and took a notepad from her bag. While she waited, she wrote down a list of every category of document she intended to look for inside the unit: property records, bank statements, correspondence, photographs, contracts of any kind, legal filings. She organized the list by priority most legally significant at the top. She had been making organized lists for 52 years. The skill transferred. 40 minutes later, Horatio returned with a key and a liability waiver. He slid both across the counter. "Sign here confirming you're accessing the unit as legal heir," he said. Lavinia read the waiver completely before signing it. Horatio noticed this. He did not comment. She walked the length of the concrete corridor under fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of annoyance. The air was cool and dry and completely still, the carefully maintained nothing of a storage facility air that existed only to preserve whatever people chose to put in its keeping. Unit 1174, a green metal door with a combination padlock and white painted numbers. Lavinia inserted the key, turned it, and gripped the door handle. She paused. She put her hand flat against the surface of the door. The metal was cold and slightly rough under her palm. She thought about Mortimer in his chair. She thought about the coffee still warm on the side table beside him. She thought about 46 years and what they contained. Then she pulled the door up. What she found was not furniture, not holiday decorations, not the accumulated randomness of a life partially stored. What she found was a system. Metal shelving along both walls, floor to ceiling, with cardboard boxes arranged in precise chronological order, each one labeled in Mortimer's handwriting, with a date range and a category. 2 gray filing cabinets against the back wall, and in the far corner a small wooden desk with a gooseneck lamp and a straight-backed chair tucked neatly underneath it. This was not storage. This was an office. Someone had sat at that desk and run something from it for a very long time. Someone with Mortimer's handwriting and Mortimer's taste for order had built a filing system in a rented room in California and maintained it for 35 years. Lavinia walked to the shelves. She found the earliest boxes and started there. The box labeled Correspondence 1990 to 1992 contained letters, dozens of them bundled in rubber bands by year written in a woman's handwriting on pale yellow stationery. The return address on each envelope was a residential street in Oceanside, California. The letters were addressed to a P.O. box, also in Oceanside, which Lavinia now understood had served as Mortimer's California mail address, a delivery point entirely disconnected from anything she had ever seen or known about. She opened the first letter and read it. The handwriting was round and deliberate, the kind developed by someone who learned penmanship as a matter of discipline and maintained it as a matter of pride. The date in the upper right corner was March of 1990. The letter began, "My darling," and continued for 2 pages. Lavinia read it to the end. She opened the next one, and the next. The woman's name was Adelaide. She had a daughter. The daughter's name was Rosalind. In March of 1990, Rosalind was learning to roll over. Adelaide wrote that she had laughed out loud when it happened alone in the apartment, laughing at a baby on a blanket on the floor. Lavinia looked at this date on the letter again. March 1990. Garrison had been 18 months old in March of 1990. She had been managing a toddler's molars coming in. All that month, interrupted nights, a child who screamed at 2 in the morning for reasons she could not always identify. Mortimer had been at a conference in Indianapolis that March. He had come home with a jar of apple butter and said the city had nothing interesting to recommend it. She opened letters from 1991 and 1992. Rosalind learned to walk. Rosalind said her first word, which was light because Adelaide had a lamp with a pull chain near the crib, and Rosalind had watched the light go on and off 1,000 times before she named it. Mortimer sent money every month. Adelaide thanked him in specific, careful terms, itemizing what the money had covered: rent and groceries and a pediatrician visit and new shoes because Rosalind's feet had grown 2 sizes. Lavinia moved to the box of photographs. There was a girl with dark hair and Mortimer's jaw. Not the whole face, just that particular angle, the way the lower jaw was set slightly square, slightly forward, the expression of a person who was thinking about something and not bothering to hide it. The girl in the photographs grew from infant to child to young woman across 30 years of images arranged by year in small labeled envelopes, birthday parties, school portraits. A Christmas photograph taken in front of a small house with a wreath on the door, a woman standing behind the girl with her hand on the girl's shoulder, both of them looking at the camera. Then a photograph that stopped Lavinia completely. Mortimer was in it. He was crouching down to the level of a girl who looked to be about 7 years old. He was looking at her, not at the camera, his full attention directed at this child. And he was smiling. Not the polite smile of a man at a social obligation, not the distracted smile of a man thinking about something else. The complete smile, the one that reached into his eyes and meant he was actually present, actually somewhere, instead of managing the appearance of being somewhere. Lavinia knew that smile. She had seen it at Willard's college graduation, at Gwendolyn's wedding, at Garrison's first baseball game where Garrison finally hit a ball past the infield, and Mortimer had stood up from the bleachers and made a sound she had never heard him make before. Mortimer had given that smile to Rosalind too. In a photograph Lavinia was never supposed to see, in a room Lavinia was never supposed to enter, 3,000 miles from the life he had constructed with her. She set the photograph down on the desk and sat in Mortimer's chair. The chair was slightly worn at the armrest, the fabric compressed from repeated use. Someone had sat in this chair many times. She was sitting in the shape her husband had left behind in a room she had not known existed. She did not cry. She was somewhere past the place where crying would have been an adequate response. What she felt was larger and stranger than that, something that had no clean name. The sensation of watching the known world reorganize itself into a configuration that had apparently always been true and was only now becoming visible. She gave herself 3 minutes. She knew this because she looked at her watch when she sat down and looked at it again when she stood up. Then she opened the bank statements. The account was held in 2 names, Mortimer R. Langford, Adelaide K. Morse, a joint savings account at a bank she had never heard of maintained at a branch in San Diego. The most recent statement she could find showed a balance of $318,000. She found the transfer records filed in a separate folder. Monthly transfers beginning in late 1989 from a personal account she did not recognize into the joint account. The amount varied but followed a consistent upward pattern. She took a pen from her bag and worked the arithmetic on the back of an envelope the way she had always worked arithmetic, carefully, methodically, without shortcuts. Average monthly transfer across 35 years, approximately $2,500. 12 months per year. 35 years. The number she arrived at was $1,050,000. She looked at the number for a moment. Mortimer's total pre-tax earnings over his career were something she could estimate from the tax returns she had found in the house before the move. Roughly $2.4 million across 3 decades. He had directed approximately $1 million of that into an account she did not know existed, into a life she did not know existed, into a woman and a child in California, while Lavinia packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside and sat in emergency rooms alone in the middle of the night and wrote $31,000 worth of checks to a son who never asked why she kept saying yes. $1 million. That was the weight of what she had not known. That was the number Mortimer had decided she did not need to see. She kept reading. There were birthday cards Mortimer had written to Rosalind, stored in a separate box labeled personal 1 card per year for 29 years. The handwriting was his. She would have known it anywhere, the particular way he formed the letter M, the small flourish on the capital L. The cards were affectionate and specific, mentioning things Rosalind had accomplished or said or done in the previous year, the kind of card a father writes when he has been paying close attention. There were report cards. Rosalind had been a strong student, particularly in mathematics. There was a small velvet box containing a gold necklace with a single pearl pendant and a note inside that said, "For Rosalind on her sweet 16-year father." There were receipts for private school tuition for 6 years. Mortimer Langford had known the name of his daughter's school. He had known her GPA. He had known her shoe size and her birthday, and what she liked to do in summer, and which subjects she struggled with, and which ones came naturally. He had known these things with the attentiveness of a man who was genuinely present in a life, not managing it from a distance. Lavinia thought about the spiral notebook, the one that contained 20 years of her children's schedules and not a single line about herself. She stood up from the desk. There were 2 gray filing cabinets against the back wall. She had been working through the shelves systematically and had not yet reached them. She moved to the first one. It opened without a key. Inside were folders of financial records, utility bills for a California address, maintenance records for a property insurance documents. The second cabinet had a combination lock on the top drawer. She tried Mortimer's birthday, nothing. She tried their wedding anniversary, nothing. She tried Willard's birthday, nothing. She tried Garrison's birthday. The lock turned. She stood there for a moment after it opened, her hand still on the drawer handle. Mortimer had chosen Garrison. Not the daughter he had kept secret, not the woman he had loved in California. He had chosen the birthday of Lavinia's youngest child, the one she had spent 30 years worrying about most, the one she had never stopped giving money to, even when she had less and less of it to give, as the combination to the lock that protected his most sensitive secrets. Mortimer had known exactly which name Lavinia would think of last. He had known which one she would least suspect of holding a key. She pulled open the drawer. The folder inside was labeled property. Inside the folder was a deed, a residential property, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a corner lot in Carlsbad, California. Purchased in 1996. Mortgage satisfied in full in 2008. The most recent property tax statement listed the assessed value at $1,240,000. She read the names on the deed. Mortimer R. Langford, Willard A. Langford. Lavinia set the deed on top of the filing cabinet. She put both hands flat on the surface beside it and looked at her son's name printed on a legal document describing a property worth more than $1 million in a state where Lavinia had never been connected to a secret Mortimer had maintained for 35 years. Willard had known. He had not found out when Mortimer died. He had not discovered this the way Lavinia was discovering it now in pieces in a room that shouldn't exist. His name was on the deed. His name had been on that deed since at least the early 2000s, based on the property tax records she found in the folder beneath it, which showed Willard listed as co-owner across filing years, stretching back more than 2 decades. She went back to the shelves and found a folder she had set aside earlier, a collection of printed emails she had initially taken for routine correspondence. She read them now with different eyes. The email at the top of the stack was from Willard to Mortimer, dated 2019. The subject line was blank. The message was 11 words. "Dad, don't tell her anything. I'll manage it when the time comes. Just leave it." Mortimer had replied. 3 words. "You're right, okay." Lavinia read those 3 words several times. In 2019, Mortimer had been 77 years old. He had been diagnosed with the first of what would become 2 heart-related episodes that preceded his final one. He had been, according to what he wrote in his reply to his son, willing to defer to Willard's judgment about whether his wife of 45 years deserved to know the truth. "You're right, okay." She found the letter in the back of the second drawer, a white envelope sealed with her name written on the front in Mortimer's hand. Lavinia in the same script she had seen on 30 years of birthday cards written to another man's child. She opened it, one page, dated the fall of 2019, 4 years before his death. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that what had begun as a mistake had grown into something he did not know how to dismantle without destroying everything. He wrote that the house in Carlsbad and the money in the account had always been intended for her, that she was the one who deserved to be taken care of, that he had planned to tell her and had run out of time and had been a coward about it for longer than he wanted to admit. Lavinia read it twice, then she placed it on the filing cabinet next to the deed, next to the printed email that said, "You're right, okay," and she looked at both documents together. Mortimer had written her an apology in 2019. In the same year he had told his son to say nothing. He had meant both things simultaneously. He had wanted to be forgiven, and he had also wanted to be protected, and in the end, he had chosen the protection and called it running out of time. She put both documents in her bag. She spent the next 40 minutes carefully replacing every document in the cabinet, every box on the shelves, every envelope and statement and card and photograph, returning everything to its exact position. When she was finished, the room looked exactly as it had when she opened the door. She walked back to the car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Then she drove 3 blocks to a copy shop she had passed on the way in. A teenager behind the counter wearing headphones looked up when she entered. She placed her stack of documents on the counter. The deed, the bank statements, the transfer records, the 2019 email, the letter from Mortimer in the most recent property tax filing. I need 2 copies of everything, she said, in the same order. That's going to take maybe 40 minutes. That's fine. She sat in a chair near the window and waited. Outside, a woman walked by pushing a stroller. A man in a truck idled at the light. California went about its business indifferent and bright and completely unaware that an 80-year-old woman from Ohio was sitting in a copy shop 3 blocks from a storage unit, assembling the evidence of a 35-year deception with the same systematic patience she had once applied to school schedules and grocery lists and everything else nobody had noticed she was doing. When the copies were ready, she organized them into 2 identical packets, each in its own folder. One for herself, one for a lawyer. She paid in cash $22 and walked back to the car. She returned the key to Horatio Kowalski without explaining anything. He handed her a receipt and she thanked him, and that was the end of that. She drove to the airport. She returned the car. She went through security. She found her gate. The flight back to Columbus departed at 7:15 in the evening. Lavinia sat in the window seat with her bag in her lap and her hands resting on top of it, and she did not sleep, and she did not read, and she did not ask the flight attendant for anything. She was thinking. She was 80 years old with no legal training, no experience in probate proceedings, no familiarity with real estate litigation or financial fraud claims, and a single suitcase containing 2 copies of documents that described in precise legal and financial detail the scale of what had been taken from her by the man she had married and the son she had raised. Willard thought she had gone back to her apartment in Columbus to eat cereal and count cars in the parking lot. He was going to find out he had been wrong about that. The plane landed at 11:47. The terminal was nearly empty. Lavinia collected her bag, walked to the taxi stand, and got in the first car in line. "Where to?" the driver asked. "3rd Street, Lavinia said. "I need to find a lawyer's office." "Tonight?" "No," she said. "First thing tomorrow morning." Beatrice Wainwright's office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building on 3rd Street above a dry cleaner whose exhaust vent released warm, chemical-scented air onto the sidewalk below. The sign on the frosted glass door said Wainwright Law, Estate and Family Matters, and below that, in smaller letters, by appointment. Lavinia had not made one. She knocked anyway. Beatrice Wainwright was 58 years old with silver hair, cut close, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead the way a person wears them when they have been taking them on and off all morning. She opened the door herself, which suggested she was either between clients or without staff, and she looked at Lavinia with the direct assessing attention of someone who spent her professional life determining quickly whether a person in front of her had a real problem or a manageable one. "I don't have an appointment," Lavinia said. "I have documents." Beatrice stepped back from the door. Lavinia came in and sat down across from the desk and placed both folders on the surface between them. She did not explain what was in them. She said only what she had said to herself on the plane the night before the sentence she had been shaping for 11 hours in the dark above the country. "My family took things from me that belonged to me. I want them back." Beatrice picked up the first folder and began to read. She read for 40 minutes. Lavinia sat in the chair and looked around the office. A small potted plant on the windowsill, green and overgrown in the pleasant way of a plant that has been given consistent water and occasional neglect. A painting on the wall, not a diploma, an oil painting of an open field in late afternoon light, the kind of painting a person hangs because they find it genuinely restoring. A coffee mug on the corner of the desk with text printed on the side that Lavinia had to tilt her head slightly to read. It said, nevertheless she persisted. Lavinia looked at that mug for a while. Then she looked back at Beatrice, who was still reading her expression, giving nothing away, one hand occasionally making a small note on a legal pad. Beatrice put the last document down and looked across the desk. "You organized these yourself," she said, "by category." "Yes." "How long did that take you?" "About an hour on the plane. I had already been thinking about the structure." Beatrice looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. Then she said, "Mrs. Langford, I need to ask you 12 questions. Please answer them as precisely as you can." She asked them. Lavinia answered each one without elaboration beyond what was useful. without emotional digression, without the apologetic circling that sometimes accompanies difficult disclosures. She had spent 2 days moving through shock into something that functioned more like clarity, and clarity, she had discovered, was a surprisingly efficient state of mind. When the 12th answer was given, Beatrice set her pen down. Ohio law entitled a surviving spouse to a share of the decedent's estate, including assets that had been concealed during the marriage. The Carlsbad property had been purchased using Mortimer's income, which was marital income under Ohio law, and subject to equitable distribution, regardless of how the title was held. The joint account with Adelaide Morse had been funded from the same source. Mortimer's will, which Lavinia produced from her bag, along with everything else, left his entire estate to his wife. Willard had no legal claim to the Carlsbad property beyond his name on the deed, and that name could be challenged given the circumstances of how it came to be there. As for the sale of the Columbus house, the proceeds of which had gone into no trust that existed in any legal or documented form, that was not a gray area. That's civil fraud, Beatrice said, straightforwardly. How strong is the case? Beatrice did not hesitate. Very strong. The documentation you've recovered is unusually complete. Most people in your position wouldn't have found half of this. Most people in my position, Lavinia said, would have thrown away the storage invoice. Beatrice almost smiled. How do you want to proceed? I want everything that's legally mine. The Carlsbad property transferred to my name, the bank account in full, a complete accounting of the Columbus sale proceeds. And I want Willard to tell his brother and sister exactly what he did. All of it. No version of it the real thing. He'll resist. I expect so. His lawyer will try to negotiate a reduced settlement. They'll claim the property has outstanding liabilities, that the account has been partially drawn down for legitimate management expenses. It's standard. Then we don't settle below my terms. Beatrice looked at her with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite surprise, but contained elements of both. I'll draft the letter today, she said. The certified letter reached Willard 4 days later. Lavinia knew the day had arrived because she had paid for tracking. She watched the delivery confirmation appear on the library's public computer at 9:40 in the morning, and then she walked home and made herself lunch and ate it at the small table by the window and did not wait for the phone to ring. She had things to do. Willard called at 9:17 that evening. She had been in bed reading, which she had started doing again recently, something she had not done regularly since before Mortimer's illness, and she put the book face down on the blanket when the phone rang and answered it on the second ring. His voice was different. The evenness was gone, the practiced steadiness of a man who had spent decades managing conversations toward predetermined outcomes. What replaced it was something Lavinia had not heard from her son since he was a teenager and had been caught in a lie about where he had spent a Friday night. Not remorse, something rawer than remorse. The sound of a person standing at the edge of a situation they cannot talk their way out of. Mom, you have to understand, Dad asked me to handle this. He wrote me a letter saying the opposite, a pause. What he meant was that he wanted the assets protected until the time was right to Willard. She said his name the way she had said it when he was 12 and was explaining something that did not hold together. Not unkind, just precise. You had your father's estate lawyer on the phone within 48 hours of his death. You had the house listed before I had finished thanking people for the flowers they sent to the funeral. You moved me into a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator and stopped returning my calls within 3 weeks. That is not a man protecting his mother's assets until the time is right. That is a man who believed I would not ask questions. Silence on the line. Tell me you're going to fight this, Lavinia said. So I know whether to call Beatrice tonight or wait until morning. Mom, tell me yes or no. Another silence. She could hear him breathing. She had heard that breathing for 54 years, since the delivery room, since the night she sat beside his bed when he was sick, since every difficult conversation they had ever had across half a century. She knew the rhythm of it better than he did. What do you want? He finally said. She told him. The Carlsbad property in her name, the bank account transferred completely, a full audit of the Columbus sale, And he would tell Gwendolyn and Garrison everything personally without lawyers present, without a filtered version designed to minimize his own culpability. He tried to negotiate. The property had issues, he said. The roof some deferred maintenance. The account had been partially used for management costs he could document. Then document them, Lavinia said. Beatrice will review everything. Telling Gwendolyn and Garrison will destroy what's left of this family. She had thought about how to answer this before the call, turning the words over until they were exact. The family was already gone, she said. It went the day you decided that what your father built in California was worth more than telling your mother the truth. You don't get to use the word family now as though it's something you have been protecting. He was quiet for a long time after that. I need a few days, he said. You have 30. Beatrice's letter was clear on that. She hung up and picked her book back up and read for another 20 minutes before turning off the light. 3 days after Lavinia's call with Will, Beatrice received a letter from Aldous Abbott. The letterhead listed a firm on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, the kind of address designed to communicate that the person sending the letter had resources. Abbott argued that the Carlsbad property carried significant outstanding financial obligations and that the joint account with Adelaide Morse had been substantially reduced by what he called legitimate asset management costs incurred on behalf of the decedent's estate. He proposed that Lavinia accept 40% of the property's appraised value and 60% of the remaining account balance as a full and final settlement. Beatrice called Lavinia to read her the letter. Lavinia listened to the end without interrupting. Then she said no. Abbott will delay. That's what this is. He'll file procedural motions to request extensions on every deadline. Make this take as long as possible in the hope that you will accept a lesser amount to make it stop. How long could he extend it? 6 months to a year before we'd see the inside of a probate courtroom. Lavinia was quiet for a moment. I'm 80 years old, Beatrice. I can wait a year. Willard cannot afford for this to go to court, and he knows it. Abbott is theater. Beatrice said, I'll respond accordingly. 7 days after Abbott's letter, Willard called again. No lawyer on the line this time. His voice had changed again, contracted further, the voice of a man who had spent a week looking at his options and found them fewer than he had expected. All right, he said. All terms. All terms. Beatrice moved quickly. Within 60 days, the deed to the Carlsbad property was transferred into Lavinia Langford's name, loan bond. The joint account was closed and its full balance, $318,000, was transferred to a new account in Lavinia's name at a bank she had chosen herself. The audit of the Columbus sale was conducted by a third-party forensic accountant Beatrice retained, and it confirmed that Willard had retained $90,000 all in proceeds that should have passed to Lavinia. He repaid it in a single cashier's check delivered by courier on a Wednesday morning. No note was attached. Lavinia deposited the check the same afternoon at a branch of the bank. She had selected a modest regional institution she had chosen because it was 4 blocks from the apartment and had a branch manager who had been patient with her questions when she came in to open the account 2 weeks earlier. The teller who processed the deposit did not react to the amount. Lavinia did not expect her to. She walked home carrying nothing. The folder was empty. The transaction was complete. That evening, she opened the closet and took out the red toolbox. She had not opened it in several weeks. She looked at what was inside. The screwdrivers, the wrench, the yellow tape, the small box of nails, the tools Mortimer had used to maintain the house they had shared, the house he had sold to their son while she was still arranging the flowers from his funeral. She carried the toolbox down the 3 flights of stairs and out the back of the building to the alley where the dumpsters were kept. She set it down carefully. She stood there for a moment in the evening air, the alley lit by a single overhead lamp, and she looked at the red paint worn thin at the corners. Then she went back upstairs. She did not look back. Philippa Caldwell called 2 days later. Word had traveled through the neighborhood on Maple Creek Drive, the way news always traveled there through the quiet, efficient network of people who had lived near each other long enough to notice when things changed. I heard Willard sold the house, Philippa said. I heard there was some trouble with the money. There was, Lavinia said. It's been resolved. And you're all right. I'm learning to be. Philippa was quiet for a moment. Lavinia, can I ask you something? You always have. Did you know before you found the storage invoice, Did any part of you know something wasn't right? Lavinia sat down at the small table by the window. Outside, the parking lot was half empty in the early evening. She did not count the cars. I knew, she said slowly, that there were questions I wasn't asking. I told myself it was because I trusted Mortimer. But I think the real reason was that I was afraid of what asking would require me to do next. If I asked and got an answer, I would have to act on it, and I didn't know how. And now you do. Now I do, Lavinia said. Willard called Gwendolyn and Garrison as agreed. Lavinia was not present for either conversation, and she did not ask for a report. Gwendolyn called her 2 days after speaking with Willard. Lavinia had expected many things from that call. Anger possibly, defensive silence, the particular form of guilt that expresses itself as accusation. What she got was none of those things. Gwendolyn's voice was measured and clear. The voice of a woman who had been sitting with difficult information for 48 hours and had worked through most of the easier reactions to get to something more honest. I want to say that I know Willard did something wrong, Gwendolyn said, but I also need to say that I let it happen. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want the answers. I was busy and I told myself you were fine, and I didn't call because calling would have meant finding out you weren't. Lavinia listened to all of it. I don't need you to explain it, she said when Gwendolyn had finished. I need you to come. Gwendolyn flew to Carlsbad in March. Lavinia had moved into the house by then slowly with the particular deliberateness of a person who is choosing each object that enters a space rather than simply transferring one life into another. She had bought a bed, a reading chair, and a small kitchen table. The walls were bare. The room smelled of fresh paint and the faint, sweet drift of citrus from the tree in the front yard. Gwendolyn arrived with a rental car and 2 suitcases and a look on her face that was half apprehension and half something Lavinia recognized as the particular alertness of a person who has decided to be present in a way they have not always been. They did not talk about Mortimer or Willard or the storage unit or any of it that first day. They drove to a thrift shop on the main street and found a kitchen table, solid oak, the surface marked with the rings of other people's coffee cups, the legs slightly uneven so that it rocked gently if you pressed on one corner. They found chairs in 3 different styles that somehow agreed with each other. They bought curtains for the bedroom and a doormat for the front step. That first evening, they sat at the new table with takeout containers between them and ate without ceremony, and the window was open, and the air that came through it carried salt and something blooming from somewhere down the block, and neither of them needed to say what it meant to be sitting there together. Some things communicate themselves without language if you let them. Garrison came in April. He arrived at the front door with a duffel bag and the expression of a man who genuinely did not know whether he would be welcomed, which told Lavinia something about the conversation he had with Willard, how complete it had been, how little he had been able to soften. She opened the door and stepped back to let him in. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. They sat at the oak table with coffee and did not speak for a while, which had always been acceptable between them because Garrison was a person who needed to arrive somewhere internally before he could say anything useful, and Lavinia had always known how to give him time for that. Mom, he said finally, I'm sorry I never asked what you needed. I never told you, Lavinia said. That was my part of it. He looked at her across the table. What do you need right now? What would actually help? She thought about it. She gave the question the time it deserved. Call me on Wednesdays, she said. Not for any reason. Just call. Garrison nodded. Okay. He stayed 4 days. He fixed the uneven leg on the kitchen table with a folded piece of cardboard and a small amount of wood glue he found at a hardware store 2 blocks away. He was not good at it, and the repair was imperfect, but the table no longer rocked. Lavinia drove to Oceanside once more before she made any final decisions about her life in California. She parked near the building where Adelaide Morse had once lived, the address she had found in the correspondence files. She sat with the engine running and looked at the building's front entrance. She had rehearsed no version of what she might say. She had no speech prepared, no list of grievances to deliver, no questions that required answers Adelaide Morse could provide. Adelaide had not made the choices that had shaped Lavinia's life. Mortimer had made them. Willard had extended them. Adelaide Morse was a woman who had loved a man who had not been honest with her either, because no man who maintains a secret of that scale is honest with anyone. Lavinia sat for a while. Then she drove back to Carlsbad. She returned to Clearwater Storage one final time on a bright morning in late January, the light coming off the Pacific with the particular clarity of winter sun in Southern California, sharp and clean and without sentiment. Horatio Kowalski handed her the key without consulting his computer. She walked the corridor alone. She opened Unit 1174 for the last time. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the shelves, the filing cabinets, the desk and chair in the corner. 35 years of a parallel life organized and preserved with the same systematic care Mortimer had apparently applied to everything he did not want discovered. She had brought 2 large boxes and a roll of tape. She worked steadily for an hour, transferring the contents of the shelves and the filing cabinets into the boxes without reviewing any of it again. She had read everything once. Once was enough. She taped the boxes closed and loaded them into the back of her car. The commercial shredding facility was 12 minutes away. A man in a gray coverall took her boxes without comment and processed them through a machine that reduced 35 years of correspondence and financial records and birthday cards and love letters to strips of fiber that would be compacted and disposed of by end of business. Lavinia stood and watched until both boxes were empty. The letters from Adelaide, the photographs of Rosalind at 7 and 12 and 16, the bank statements, the transfer records, Mortimer's birthday cards to a daughter he had never acknowledged publicly, the 2019 email, Mortimer's apology letter, the original, she kept the copy. All of it gone. What she felt when the machine stopped was not the thing she had expected to feel. It was not release in the dramatic sense, not the sudden lifting of a burden, not peace arriving in a recognizable form. It was quieter than that. It was the specific, unremarkable sensation of finishing something that needed to be finished, the same feeling she had experienced after washing the last dish at the end of a long dinner, after signing the last item on a long list, after completing any task that had required sustained attention and was now simply done. She thanked the man in the coverall. She got in her car. She drove back to Carlsbad along the coast road with the windows down. She joined a walking group that met in her neighborhood at 7 in the morning, 6 women who walked 2 miles along the coastal path 3 times a week and talked about their gardens and their grandchildren and their doctors and the particular pleasures and indignities of living in their own bodies at their particular ages. A woman named Prudence Nguyen, who had retired from 30 years of teaching and had the easy, unhurried conversational rhythm of someone with no remaining need to impress anyone, fell into step beside Lavinia on the first morning and did not ask a single intrusive question, which Lavinia registered as a form of grace. After the third walk, Prudence suggested coffee at a place 2 blocks from the trailhead. They sat at a table outside with the morning still cool around them and talked about the neighborhood and the best time of year for the coastal wildflowers and whether the new bakery that had opened on the main street was as good as everyone was saying. "How long have you been in Carlsbad?" Prudence asked at some point in the second cup. "A few months," Lavinia said. "You like it." Lavinia looked at the street, the ordinary Saturday morning of a California coastal town, people with bikes and strollers and cups of coffee, the light coming in at a low winter angle that made everything look considered. "I do," she said. "It took me a while to understand that I was allowed to." Prudence looked at her over the rim of her cup with the mild, attentive expression of a woman who has spent 30 years in a room full of young people learning when to wait and when to ask. She waited. "I spent a long time," Lavinia said, "believing that taking care of other people was the agreement. That was what I had signed up for, and if I honored it completely enough, the other party would honor it in return. It seemed fair, and it wasn't." "The other party," Lavinia said, "had a different agreement running in parallel, one I wasn't informed of." Prudence nodded slowly. "What happens now without the agreement?" Lavinia set her cup down. She had been turning this question over for weeks, not anxiously, but with the quiet attention she now gave to things that mattered. "I find out what I actually want," she said. I'm 80 years old and I have not spent very much time on that particular question. It turns out there's quite a lot of ground to cover. Prudence smiled. It was a smile that understood something without requiring it to be explained further. Well, she said, you've got time. Lavinia thought about whether that was true and decided it was true enough. She had a house in a city she had chosen. She had a bank account with her name alone on it. She had a daughter who had come and hung curtains and sat at a table and meant it. She had a son who called on Wednesdays, not always on Wednesday, sometimes Thursday, but close enough and getting more consistent. She had a walking group and a neighbor named Prudence, in a coastal path, and mornings that belonged entirely to her to use as she saw fit. On the first morning in February, that felt like the actual beginning of something, rather than the continuation of something else. Lavinia woke before the sun. She made coffee in her kitchen in her house, in a city she had come to, by following a storage invoice that her son had told her to throw away. She carried the mug to the front step and sat down. The street was quiet. The light was that particular quality of early morning dark that is not quite dark anymore. The sky beginning to separate itself from the earth at the horizon line. The air was cool and carried salt and something she had come to associate specifically with this yard, this patch of California ground, the faint green sweetness of the lemon tree standing 10 feet away with its branches heavy with fruit. She set the mug down on the step beside her and stood up. She walked to the tree and reached up and closed her hand around one of the lemons, feeling the weight of it, the roughness of the rind, the solid, specific realness of a thing that had grown without anyone's permission on a piece of land that was now legally, completely, and without any remaining ambiguity, hers. She brought it inside. She cut it on the counter, the knife going through cleanly, the smell opening into the kitchen like a statement. She squeezed the juice into her coffee and watched it cloud the surface and smelled the particular sharpness of it, that combination of bitter and bright that does not apologize for being what it is. She carried the cup back to the step and sat down and drank it while the light came up over the rooftops of Carlsbad, California. Lavinia Langford had been a wife for 46 years. She had been a mother for 52. She had been the person who kept the notebook and wrote the checks and drove the carpools and sat in the emergency rooms and held the household together with the steady, invisible labor of someone who believed in the terms of an agreement that the other parties had not read as carefully as she had. She had been lied to by the man she trusted most. She had been stolen from by the child she had raised. She had been carried down 3 flights of stairs in everything she owned and left on a public sidewalk with 4 words. And now she was here. Not healed, not finished, not arrived at some final resolution that tied everything into a meaning she could be comfortable with. Just here, on a step in the morning light with a cup of coffee that was bitter and bright and tasted exactly like what it was. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than she had been given in a very long time. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She had things to do today and tomorrow and after that, and none of them required anyone's permission.